great pleasure to welcome our first keynote speaker for this morning, Mr. Brian Haratsis. I'll get into it. Brian is an economist and futurist with over 30 years' experience. He's one of the most trusted advisors in this country. He's the founder and executive chairman of MacroPlan. He's just recently been appointed co-chair of the Australian Driverless Vehicle Initiative, and he's also the author in his spare time of 3 books, including his most recent, Destructive Cities. Opening the conference today with a presentation on destructive cities, would you please join me again in welcoming Brian Haratsis to the stage.
This is great. I think I'll start dancing to the music. Oh, that's great. Good morning, everybody. What about the Cowboys? Yeah? Well, what about Richmond and... No, yeah, that's exactly right. What a great week. It's so exciting to be here with Riverfire happening and with sport. And you get a real sense, particularly from the southern states, of just how much excitement and how much change is happening in the marketplaces. And we begin to see how much the impacts of globalization and technology are really moving our urban systems along. I'd like to congratulate Adam and his team, because there's a real gap in the marketplace for a little bit of research, a little bit of excitement, a much better understanding of technology. And it's very difficult in the professional organisations to be able to say all the things you'd really like to talk about. So congratulations, and I hope everyone really enjoys this, and I hope it really kicks off and keeps going. The theme of today is that we're not really seeing the change that's happening right in front of us. And one of the big problems, and you see it in Melbourne and Sydney to a really large extent, not so much in Brisbane, but is that because we're not seeing the change, the planning networks that we've got at the moment, the planning systems and infrastructure investment is not keeping pace with change. And so what's happening is we're actually destroying our cities in a way that we didn't expect, because cities in the next 10 years will be the motor of the Australian economy. The services sector is the current motor of employment. That's what it does. And the globalisation of the service sector will be the key thing that we need to work on and that we need to support. The ideas for the book really came out of our understanding of the service sector, and by that I mean retail, health, professional services, and moving through the broader spectrum, because we don't really know much about how the services sector work. And that's because we tend to think about economic development in terms of mining, because on the front page you see coal seam gas or we see a mining boom, and you can see that, but you can't see a services sector. And if you can't see it, it's hard to understand how it actually works. So one of the things that really came to me as the mining boom was proceeding is that we had a tourism boom. In fact, the number of international tourists coming to Australia increased dramatically as the value of the Australian dollar increased. Most people would say, that can't happen, but it did happen. And I began to understand out of that actually the competitiveness of Australian services sector is immense. So in other words, we have more international students per capita in Australia than any other country in the world. We're easily the biggest. Tourism, we think we're doing a good job at tourism. If we looked at tourism in Australia on a per capita basis, we have half the amount of tourism of New Zealand. Half on a per capita basis. The tourism boom hasn't started in Australia. You can't see it so much again in Queensland because it's the Chinese have only just starting to come here, but in Melbourne and Sydney it is palpable. So when we actually think about a services boom, how does it get driven? What are the components of it? How do you make a dollar out of it? How do you plan for it? What do you need to know to make this services sector actually work? Well, the things that became obvious to me were we know how to not make it work. And so if we actually had a look at the reasons why things don't work, first of all, we've got the highest housing prices in the world, or amongst the highest. So what does that mean? That means there's a lot of talent that won't come to Australia. And if talent doesn't come here, then we don't have a services sector and downstreamness. And I'm going to explain to you how the service sector works. Without that, and a good example of this would be medical research. Medical researchers can live anywhere. They don't have to live in Australia. And in fact, the best medical researchers don't live in Australia. We want them to live in Australia. We should want them to live in Australia. Where is medical research mainly undertaken? Well, about 70% of it's in Sydney, about 20% is in Melbourne, about 10% is spread around. So if you want internationals to come and live in Australia, it's got to be an offer. What is it? Why is this place so good? If you actually had a look then at the increasing commercial rentals, it's an expensive place. If you actually had a look at Jones Lang, or we looked at the international rentals, very high in Australia, hard to do business, traffic congestion. Melbourne and Sydney are actually hopelessly congested, and I'll show you some stats in a minute about that. And if we actually had a look at some of the more ethereal issues about equity, if living on Melbourne's and Sydney's urban fringes isn't fun anymore. It just isn't any fun because there's no public transport, you can't get anywhere, there's no schools, there are no services. In fact, it's no good. But you can get a job, but you'll have to travel 45 minutes to an hour to get a job, and you'll have to drive. So what's happening is the things that really were attractive about Australia, we're losing. And it's amazing to me that Melbourne was made the world's most livable city again this year. It just goes to show you how unlivable the other cities must actually be. And I'm a Melburnian. So the two things about destructive cities, if you want to unpack and understand where it is you'd be looking to invest or where it is you'd be looking to regulate, deregulate, it's firstly technology, and secondly, it's globalisation. And I'll unpack both of those because you hear people saying technology. Well, what is it? How does it work? And globalisation, what is it? How does it work? So the first point about understanding technology is that the focus of investment at the moment is in infrastructure investments in Melbourne and Sydney. So if you actually had a look, at the moment in Sydney, there's $36 billion worth of infrastructure investment, of which $14 billion of it's live now. It's North Connects, West Connects, George Street Light Rail, Sydney Metros, and that's without Badgerys Creek, which is a federal initiative. So you can imagine the scale of that is unbelievable. And Melbourne's not a long way behind. And of course, you look at Brisbane at the moment, and it's just not on the radar. Those levels of investment aren't there at the moment. But most of that investment is actually catch up. Because if you actually have a look at the forecasts, what happens is all of the investment in roads and rail that happens in Melbourne, Sydney, and across rail here as well, only leads us to catch up. It doesn't get us in front of the pack. In other words, the forecasts are that by 2031, if all of the projects that were in Infrastructure Australia's list, if they all happened, 94% of people would still drive to work. 94. That's what it is now. So all this money is only catch up. This is the last 20 years of inactivity. And so what that tells me is all of that money will not be spent. And because it will not be spent, and because we're going to have massive traffic congestion moving forward, that we are going to have a bit of a disaster in the way that cities work from an environmental and social perspective, but actually from an investment perspective, investing in cities is going to be fantastic. And the reason for that, if you can get a permit or a development approval to do something, if you understand the principles of each of the parts of the services sectors, so you understand where the jobs pools are, you'll understand where you actually want to be. And that's why, if you look at these graphs, that's why the price of land in the middle ring suburbs and inner ring suburbs is increasing very, very fast. So what those graphs show, and you can actually, if we actually have a look at it, for Brisbane, you can see the green line shows you that the relative price of land in the inner and middle ring in Brisbane has risen much faster than outer areas. And if you have a look in Melbourne and Sydney, look at the way Sydney's gone. And what that tells you is that the services sector is all driven by human capital. So if you're driven by human capital, what do you want to live close to? You want to live close to a professional network. You want to live next to an education network, a research network. You want to be close to the university system. And because of that, and because of traffic congestion, and because our deep understanding now of the importance of universities, everybody wants to live in inner and middle rings. And I know Tim's talking today, and he'll be able to confirm that point. And this is not going to stop. And if you actually have a look at the prices in Melbourne, in Sydney, and prices in Melbourne's prices could continue to increase quite substantially from a property point of view, because Melbourne, the wage levels in Melbourne are the same as Sydney. It's a bit lower in Brisbane. So what we're doing is we're creating very simple cities to read, because we're going to underinvest, and we are underinvesting. Because of the underinvestment, the problem for governments is that productivity doesn't increase the way it ought to. So what this shows you, and I'll show you the one for Melbourne, is that productivity, and this is individual productivity for people, is very low in fringe locations. And why is that the case? And that's the case because people living on the fringes are people who don't have high levels of education. They typically have jobs that are population driven, so they work in the retail sector. And so if, for example, you work in the retail sector, you have an award level, you can move in at award level, and you know if you're a storeman and packer or if you're a salesperson, you know that you've got a capped amount of money that you can earn in your whole life. And because you know that, you buy a house or you rent inside your capacities. But if you're in the other part of the service sector, which is known as the tradable part of the services sector, which you're all in, and that's why you're here, because you understand the benefits of knowledge, you don't have any limits to how much money you can earn. None. That's why you're here. That's why you're talking to each other. And because you know there are no limits, you're prepared to speculate, you're prepared to buy, and you're prepared to congregate and agglomerate. And that's what these graphs are showing, the way the services sector actually really works. Except that planning organisations and most of the major development groups that we work with really haven't begun to understand what the principles are that drive this new makeup of cities. And because that's not understood, there are so many opportunities that are being missed in markets all over the place. And this shows you the same situation in Melbourne, where the fringe areas are very low productivity areas. Essentially, it's land subdivision, it's great, it's cheap. Melbourne's still very inexpensive, even compared to Brisbane. A house land package in Melbourne, $380,000 house and land. You can buy that quite broadly, no problem at all, on a 400 or 500 square metre block. It's about half of Sydney. So what's happening between Melbourne and Sydney are starting to work as a pair. In other words, people from Sydney are moving to Melbourne and people from Melbourne are moving to Sydney, but when you put the two together, what you're seeing are real opportunities for entry into Melbourne and to really build wealth in Sydney. I love this quote from Albert Einstein, insanity, doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. And you can apply that to the public and the private sector, which is, if we know that globalisation is changing the market, if we know that technology has fundamentally altered the market, why would you use the same investment principles? Why would you have the same regulatory framework? Excuse me. Well, we have got the same regulatory framework, and they won't change anywhere. They just won't change anywhere in Australia. So the regulatory frameworks are entirely predictable. Everything's going to be hard and harder, and infrastructure investment's going to be low. That's not being cynical. That's the reality of it. But when you then apply that to, okay, if we know that, what does that tell us about our investment strategies? What does it tell us about where we want to be? And what does it tell us about where the service sector is likely to locate? So there's some principles that really sit behind this concept of destructive cities. And the first principle is we simply have to move to building cities at a lower cost, because we actually can't afford to build this type of city that we're building at the moment. And how do I know that? Well, I know that because you only have to look at the infrastructure backlogs that we've got at the moment. So we clearly can't afford it, and we're not going to pay for it. So we have to invent new ways to do that. If we also looked at affordable living, I just laugh about affordable living. I've just done an analysis for one of the state governments, I won't tell you which one, which demonstrated that there's no possibility of affordable housing ever being delivered. And so because of that, we're much better to focus on rental. And of course, you'd all be aware of the new build to rent, the new institutional investments there. And so the only way to deal with housing affordability is to accept that housing prices will always stay high. Don't even bother about trying to intervene in the market, because nobody will let you intervene in the market, because planners won't let you reduce standards, architects won't let you have smaller floor plates, planning authorities won't let you have smaller blocks, Builders won't be able to build any more cheaply. So what is it? What would give? Nothing. Nothing will give. And so because we know that, what we do is you actually say, there's the reality of it, so we need a market format that actually addresses that. And build to rent will work, and build to rent will be the primary way of adding stock into the rental sectors. Using technology will be absolutely critical as well. And you're probably saying to yourself, so why is this economist interested in automated vehicles? Well, I'm not just interested in automated vehicles, I'm interested in mobility as a service platforms. Why? Because what I can see in cities and city formats, and you can see from the graphs I showed, the maps I showed you of productivity, that the easiest way to actually create equity and to improve productivity is to improve mobility. Because if all the low productivity is on urban fringes, then you've got to deal with mobility. That's the starting point. Because if we're not going to change the housing structure, then the only thing you can change is mobility. So just to give you a quick view of how big the services sector is and how things work, just looking over here, you can see the service sector's, it's over 80% of all employment these days, and that's after the mining boom. It's growing very, very quickly. And if we actually had a look at exports of services, and a services export, for example, is an international tourist coming to Australia, or us building some software that's being purchased overseas, or us selling accounting services into South Asia, or us selling architectural services into South Asia. And what this shows is, sorry, we'll go back. What this shows is substantial growth in export of services around the world. And what I can tell you is it's likely next year Australia will have its first ever surplus in service exports. In other words, we will sell more services to the world than we buy. That is amazing. That's the first time in Australian history. That's because we are very good actually at delivering services, and we're very creative and innovative. But with the Australian dollar hanging at 80, it's making things a little difficult. Most economists would tell you that the dollar's probably likely to hang out at around 70 cents. If the dollar gets to 70 cents, unemployment in Australia will probably reduce down to about 4%. We'll have the biggest employment boom in Australian history. I talked a little bit about upstreamness before, and this is a piece of work that the Reserve Bank has recently done, looking at how business services actually work. And so I just want to show you, just go back and I'll show you this. And this is the most important of all the things that I'll show you today. This is the single most important thing. If we actually have a look at business services sector here and what's called upstreamness. Now, what does that mean? Okay, when we deliver an outcome, and health is a really good example of this, you need a range of different services, and over time, the services have become more complex. And so, for example, now when we visit a GP, what happens is the GP, the first thing is, they don't say hello, they actually switch on the computer. And that computer's got software in it, and they didn't build that software, that was built by somebody else. And then your name pops up, and that data set has come from another location, and then when you're leaving, you have a technology applied to you, and someone wrote the software that sits behind that technology. Then when you're leaving, the connection, there's communication to Medicare, and so you've been to see a doctor, which used to be a very simple thing, but now there's about 15, and we've actually analysed this, there are 15 technological steps in just visiting a GP. And those people, all the people that produced all of those services, are in new and different locations. And it's that business services value chain that's been created by technology and globalization is what is driving the shape of cities. And to the degree that you can apply that thinking to individual service sectors like tourism, you think about it. You know, in the old days with tourism, you jump in the car and you'd look for a no vacancy sign. Well, now what do? On the computer, Expedia, the first thing that we do. So there's 15 steps for us, even just in tourism. And this is just the start, because information and communication technologies are only just beginning. So if you begin to apply the business services concepts and new value chains, what you will get is a much more productive economy. This is brand new. This was produced by the Reserve Bank, Alexandra Heath. And what this shows is when there's more upstreamness. In other words, when there's more connected services, you get more productivity. That's level of productivity there. You can just see it increasing. It's stabilised a little bit, and they're thinking it's going to go back that way. Now, this is a 2017 piece of work by the Reserve Bank, and it's the first time, or the first parts of analysis that really began to break apart this new understanding of economics and how economics works in cities, because all of those business services occur in cities. And because they all occur in cities, places like Melbourne and Sydney are really growing quickly. And the reason that Brisbane isn't growing as quickly as Melbourne and Sydney is because Melbourne and Sydney has the upstreamness and the value chains, the business services value chains. And what's happened in Australia, both Perth, Sydney and Adelaide for a long time, have become back of house. All of the high value add parts of the value chains have gone to Melbourne and Sydney, and they're growing very, very, very quickly. And that's why employment's not growing at the rates that it should grow in Queensland, and it's very predictable. The way that employment will grow here will be population-driven only, which is called the non-tradable sector. The tradable export sector, where all the dollars are in the business services value chains, are in Melbourne and Sydney, and they will stay there. It's absolutely predictable, because the time that it would take to change a value chain is so large. The amount of embedded knowledge and embedded understanding and the amount of amenity that you need in a city to draw the people that would be required to create these new value chains is a generation. It can't be done overnight. And so, in the thinking through of investment and the thinking through of how CityShape works, it's this intergenerational thinking about embedded knowledge and understanding, but also with another layer on top of it, which is called globalization. And so, therefore, what is globalization? Now, this is a broad definition, but again, it's a little bit like the concept of technology and breaking down those steps and understanding those value chains. Globalization, and I'm going to read this because when I was doing my own thinking about 10 years ago, I read this and I thought, wow, this really looks like Melbourne. The flow of technology, knowledge, people, values, ideas, capital, goods and services across nations' borders affects each region in a different way due to the region's geography, physical attributes, resources, individual history, traditions, culture, and priorities. So globalisation is not Chinese just investing in mining. And if you thought about Melbourne, you go to Melbourne and you walk down Swanston Street now and you see a very Asian population, because there's a very high percentage of Asian people now in our universities. And what that's done is brought Asian investment into Melbourne. It's increased the amount of Asian migration into Melbourne. And we've actually been doing work looking at the number of businesses that have now been opened as a result of those two things happening together. Very significant. So now what's happening is we're getting global Chinese companies coming to Melbourne because of the population migration and educational base that's already there. And so globalisation is a deep concept. It's a deep concept with a number of linkages that happen in it. And so what I'm seeing is, over time, Melbourne and Sydney, and Brisbane could do it, but there needs to be so much more significant investment to make it happen that there would need to be a lot more effort. So the Australian services sector versus the global services sector, I've talked a little bit about it. We are very, very good at services. I've worked internationally, and I can tell you the number of companies that come to Australia and headhunt Australians, whether it's in artificial intelligence or whether it's in robotics or whether it's in the biosciences. We have some of the best biosciences in the world by a long margin. We have the best cancer research in the world. In fact, Brisbane's got some of the best cancer research in the world. So we're very, very good at a global level. And that being true, as I originally said, the only way to attract global talent, as distinct from global talent being headhunted out of Australia, is to have good cities. And so this is why I'm so passionate about Australian cities, because if we just let them run down with bad infrastructure, traffic congestion, pollution, and with no investment, then the motor of growth, you see, because the business services sector, the global business services sector, will not locate in places that don't have amenity consistent with the lifestyle that people want. And so it'll be London, it'll be Sydney, it'll be other places. Just move on. So Australian jobs growth is actually running at about 1 to 2% at the moment. But if I broke out the key services sectors, they're running at 7 and 8%, like health, education, and that's why places like Queensland and Brisbane are lagging. That because they haven't got the tradable parts of the services sector. So just to finish my little presentation, this is my car. That's why I'm co-chairman of the Autonomous Vehicles Association. This one drives itself. It's a joke, it's a 68 Monaro. So the digital revolution is with us, and anyone that thinks that it's not, I think you should really go back and have a hard look at not just automated vehicles themselves, but about mobility as a service platforms. And the reason for that is that in Finland, the mobility as a service platform, the first integrated platform, integrated data and integrated service provision, operates from next year. Audi, the A8, the fully autonomous A8, will be delivered in 2020. And I've forecast that by 2023, in Australia, we will have level 4, which is equivalent to a current Tesla, but twice as good. 2023, it'll be at about $5,000 to a car price, and everybody will be buying one, and it will probably represent around about 15% of the fleet. So by 2035, we'll have fully autonomous taxi bot running around town. Question is, how do we do that? Why do we do that? And what kind of value chains would you need to do it? So first thing is tech drivers. There are different geographies happening because of interconnectedness. And one of the things that and again, my focus on not just mobility, but focus on the Internet of Things, is that the more connectedness you get, the more knowledge you can create, the more parts of value chains you can deliver, because the more productivity you can provide means that you can sell better, more specialised services, and you'll get higher prices. So unlocking the potential of the Internet of Things, which is again something that we haven't done, good example of that. Whilst I said there's 15 steps to see a GP of technology, if you looked at remote health, it's still in its infancy. We still are nowhere near it. And reading the latest work on artificial intelligence in health, there's a great forecast that says within 10 years, AI will be so much more accurate than a GP that you wouldn't be bothered going to a GP. I don't really believe that, but I think there's something that sits behind it. So, Internet of Things coming, automated vehicles are coming, and the timeline, as you can see here, is with us. So what I really see is that, and I'm just flicking through a little bit here in terms of forecast growth and travel mode, is that because we can't deliver public transport, and this is a graph here, this is BITRA, this is the forecast future use of public transport. See, it doesn't increase. And it doesn't increase because we can't afford to provide public transport. And because of that, we will not only have automated vehicles, we will want them because it's the only way we'll be able to be mobile in Australia. And this is just a nice graph of the lack of transport investment. So over time, that just shows you the reduction. They're the real numbers that sit behind why we've got the issues that we've currently got. So AVs are really what I call a critical part of the economy and a really big competitive advantage for Australia. Just finishing off, some of the sorts of things that are important in this kind of industry are the possible jobs and investment that could be created in automated vehicles, and it's not just an individual vehicle, it's vehicle shuttles, it's what they call virtual trains which run on roads. And for those of you that think that this is not going to happen, I was invited last week to Christchurch, and New Zealand have produced the first automated vehicle in Australia and New Zealand. Now, New Zealand has not produced a motor vehicle since the 1960s, when their motor industry finished. They are now, and not only was it at the launch, it actually works. So with those few words, I just wanted to finish off with and leave you with the thought that if you can take a step back and use this conference to ask yourself the bigger questions about the principles that drive investment and the principles that are going to drive the shape of cities, you will have a big competitive advantage. I trust you'll really enjoy yourselves. I've really enjoyed this morning. I appreciate being invited, and I'm really looking forward to talking to you. So enjoy. Thank you.